Thank you, Rajarshi. Rajarshi forbore to mention that he was a long time ago my student, and a very special student. Thank you all, students and faculty, for involving me in this exciting venture. Thank you. It's not just a pleasure, it's a privilege to be a part of this endeavor, to share in this moment of quite, I think, incredible and unusual, energetic, intellectual engagement amongst the JNU community, encompassing students and faculty. I think it's a really special moment, and I'm very grateful that you invited me to be a part of it. So, what does it mean to be free? Why do we value freedom? Is it an aspiration or a desire that is somehow hardwired into our physical or psychological makeup? Or is it something that we learn to cherish through years of socialization, either because we are habituated to living in free societies, or because we have at some time in our lives experienced a denial of freedom? And almost everyone has experienced in their lives at some point a denial of freedom. Young women in India especially experience a denial of freedom in very acute ways, but I'm speaking here really of political freedom to start with. I'll get to the others in a bit. Now, none of us here clearly has personally experienced the state of unfreedom that was colonial rule. Not even me, I promise you. I came to JNU as a student in the monsoon semester of 1975. The national emergency had been declared just a month before that. It was in many ways a grim time, but it was also in many ways a very exciting time, because while you traveled in the TTC bus to the old campus, you did not speak about anything remotely political. You were careful not to do that. And yet, there was no place better than JNU to share that experience, to share that, what I might call a camaraderie of unfreedom of the time, and then to share the exhilaration when 18 months later, in the spring of 1977, our civil rights and liberties were restored. So JNU was even then a very exciting time to be in, and I think those of us who grew up and went to university in those years, and there are some people who were my contemporaries then present today, would I think recognize and became sensitive to, let me say, became sensitive to the value of freedom in a very different way, simply because we were students at that particular phase, made us sensitive to the value of freedom and to the possibilities of the denial of freedom and the dangers of that. We became aware of that in a very acute way, and I think that even today, many of us would be able to recognize that faintly familiar whiff in the present, in the contemporary. I have, however, a very specific mandate today, which is to speak about, as Rajarshi said, the intellectual lineages of the idea of freedom in the Western tradition of political philosophy. It's going to be, obviously, in 40 minutes, a very potted summary. And I'll do my best to do that potted summary with the important proviso that, is this echoing or no?
No, it's fine.
It's fine. That this is a history of and by dead white males, capitals. Right now, perhaps some of you are familiar with this expression. It's a term obviously derisive, used in the context of the Anglo-American Academy to describe the hegemony of dead white male social theorists over curricula and so on. So I think it's important to mention that the people, the main characters, the main cast in this story are going to be DWMs, and however I will try and weave in this potted summary of what they say within an analytical and conceptual account of freedom, and also interrogate some of their assumptions as I go along. And by the way, DWM is very telling if you think about Hannah Arendt. She had a thing or two to say about freedom. but she doesn't generally figure in the mainstream, any mainstream treatment of the idea of freedom, right? So she was dead, and she is dead, and she was white, but she was not male. But first, before I do that, before I embark on this potted summary, let me get one thing out of the way. Many scholars have argued, many of us have argued, that concepts like rights and freedom are somehow tainted by the genetic sin of their origins in the intellectual tradition of modernity and the Enlightenment. And therefore, it is argued, they have little credibility in contributing to an emancipatory politics in the global South. So this present moment, when we seek to defend freedom, and we seek to defend freedom by recourse to the law and the Constitution, seems to be a good time to reflect on the question, does it matter, should it matter, that the idea is an import, a Western import? Further, how might we think about it in relation to another concept of European origin, nationalism? If nationalism was, to use Partha Chatterjee's term, a derivative discourse, is the Indian idea of freedom similarly derivative and similarly tainted? In the West, the idea of freedom, even if we ignore what their ancients, the Greeks and the Romans, said about it, predated the nation state. The other of free was slave, right? And that, we are told, is the historical origin of the term. The binary was freeman and slave, freedom and slavery, but not freedom and nationalism. Freedom and nationalism had nothing to do with each other. They were about entirely different things. Freedom signified claims to non-interference by other individuals, fellow citizens, and by the state, and the importance of securing legal and political safeguards to protect those freedoms. So freedom was about putting a fence around a person, in the classical liberal idea of putting a fence around a person to make his, and it was generally his, personal space inviolate and inviolable. Nationalism was about what bound members of a territorially defined community together, race, ethnicity, culture, language, history, and so on. And therefore, nationalism was about forging bonds, not about putting fences around people. Freedom was about non-domination and the absence of restraint. Nationalism was about sentiments of association. Quite different things, in other words, because they were answers to different questions, unrelated to each other, and to speak of them otherwise would be to commit what philosophers call a category mistake. An even more egregious category mistake than perhaps the standard textbook example, which I think will resonate here. The standard textbook example of category mistakes is, because the head of state represents the nation, to say something bad about him or her is to insult the nation. This is a standard example. Okay. But in our context, we could argue that nationalism and the idea of freedom are, not conceptually, but historically, Siamese twins. Have you observed that we typically use the following terms interchangeably? National movement, freedom movement, nationalist struggle, freedom struggle, and sometimes bringing them together in opposition to colonial rule, national self-determination. Which is why it is curious that in contemporary political discourse we find nationalism rhetorically, but also conceptually pitted against freedom. And I will suggest that this is a conceptually false opposition that has been constructed between some who would fashion nationalism as a regimented straitjacket that can only be imagined in one uniform regulation way, thereby precluding freedom or diversity, and others who seek the freedom to be nationalist in their own way, or even to be, no, I won't say it, I will say post-national. Okay? So the irony is that in India, freedom has historically had a strong association with nationalism, an association that is contingent, an association that is discursive, and that's where it should remain. But the two ideas are conceptually distinct. Freedom was, in the Indian context, in the first half of the 20th century at least, the object of nationalism. Freedom was the object of nationalism. That was the purpose of nationalist mobilization. But it's not surprising, I guess, that this should escape the attention of those who chose not to, by free choice, not to participate in that movement and later made ISIS, I believe, the even worse choice and the even more free choice of not reading about it. So this opposition between freedom and nationalism is neither in tune, therefore, with the Western origins of these concepts, in which, as I said before, they were unrelated, nor with the historical contingent discursive association between them in the Indian history of the last 100 years. Now, whether or not we feel the need to reclaim that historical association, and it might be anachronistic to even think that we should, it is clear that the idea of freedom finds a home in many diverse ideological locations and in different geographies, which is why it is worth looking at the philosophical lineages of the idea of freedom, if only to be able to reflect more meaningfully and critically on our particular and changing conceptions of it. Even if it is a derivative discourse of modernity and the Enlightenment, it has been imbued with local meaning and value, though I'm not discussing that local meaning and value today, but that bears thinking about. And I'll leave this idea here now and get to my mandated task to show you why freedom is what political theorists call an essentially contested concept. So, freedom has been a core preoccupation, some might say an obsession, of political philosophers for at least 300 years, even though there are fundamental disagreements among them about how to define it and how to interpret it. Similar disagreements bedevil political practices and discourses. There are countries that invade other countries in order to bring freedom to them, like it's something that can be nicely gift-wrapped, sometimes in bombs, of course, and delivered. And if that isn't the very antithesis of freedom, one doesn't know what is. There's a funny bumper sticker which you might have seen. It sums up this very well. It says, you just substitute the word freedom for the word democracy. It says, be nice to America or we'll bring democracy to your country. It is hard to say whether new ways of restricting freedom grow faster than new ways of expanding freedom. On the whole, it seems to me to be the case that the expansion of freedom takes a much longer time and a great deal of struggle. And this is true not just of struggles for freedom from colonial rule, but struggles against slavery, struggles for the vote for women, struggles against racial segregation and the denial of civil rights and liberties for people of other races. All of these struggles, which we know about across the world, have taken a long, long time, and they were the products of protracted and sustained struggle. On the other hand, and frequently enabled by technology, but not only by technology, new ways of curtailing and curbing freedom keep evolving at an alarming rate. The most recent Freedom House Index, and I know the Freedom House Index is far from perfect, documents a new development which is important, that in 2015, a number of countries lost ground due to state surveillance, restrictions on internet communications, and curbs on personal autonomy. These are clear and present dangers everywhere, not just in the countries that are ranked low on the Freedom House Index. Even in countries that are considered very free, these are clear and present dangers. But let's leave these aside to focus for a minute on the old and familiar ones. A minute ago I mentioned governments that are inspired by an almost missionary zeal to take freedom to the citizens of other countries. They don't generally bother to check if those citizens of other countries want their freedom. A classic illustration of Rousseau's idea of being forced to be free. And then there are governments that make economic policies that they justify in the name of freedom, even though these policies are almost designed to produce and to foster inequality and arguably result in a denial of freedom for the poor. And no doubt you've heard in the Indian context on the business pages of the papers, frequent exhortations to release or unleash what Keynes called the animal spirits. Yeah? Of course, conversely, the world has also seen totalitarian states which justify the denial of civil liberties and political freedoms in the name of a more substantive conception of freedom and self-realization to be achieved through coercive forms of economic organization and distribution. In other words, what I'm trying to say here is that freedom can be a progressive idea, but it can also be a conservative idea. The idea of freedom can be suborned and aligned to a variety of social, economic, and political projects. Most of the arguments that are used to justify these different deployments of the concept of freedom have their lineages in the Western intellectual history of the concept. And it is these strands that I will try and untangle and separate so that we can, by looking at and that's where the classroom part comes in, so that we can, by looking at the pedigree of particular usages, more easily recognize the perils that of these arguments or the protections that they may afford, right? Most of these debates can be traced back to the Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries, the period when science and reason came to be privileged over tradition, when the authority of the Pope and the King, the monarch, came equally to be challenged, with important consequences for thinking about individuals, the state, and politics. And this is the time you have the impulse to freedom expressed in the slogans of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, fraternity, liberty coming first, and the American Revolution and Constitution: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, whatever that was a euphemism for. So some fundamental disagreements about freedom also originated in the Enlightenment. It's not a uniform narrative. Locke and Rousseau, for instance, are exemplars of two powerful but quite different traditions of thinking about freedom, both of which are products of the Enlightenment. Of course, most of these debates are internal to liberalism, the classical liberal account of freedom varying quite considerably from what I will call genetically modified liberalism or positive liberalism, which is a more familiar term. But not entirely internal to liberalism either, because remember, Marxism is also a philosophy of the Enlightenment and has a very distinctive understanding of freedom as emancipation and liberation. So let me now come to the question of freedom, negative and positive. At the root of some of these disagreements that I just mentioned lies a customary distinction between negative and positive freedom, which tends to often get translated into labels like negative liberalism and positive liberalism to indicate the sort of progenitors and sponsors of these ideologies. This distinction has been found its most famous articulation and formulation in Isaiah Berlin's essay, Two Concepts of Liberty, which was his inaugural address as the titular professor of social and political theory at Oxford in 1958. So he's writing against the backdrop of Stalinist Russia, and that shows. I'll come to that in a minute. In Berlin's words, and I'll read a little bit here, the two concepts of freedom. The negative concept of freedom, according to Berlin, answers the question: what is the area within which the subject, a person or group of persons, is or should be left to do or be what he is able to do or be without interference by other persons? The positive concept, on the other hand, seeks to answer the question: what or who is the source of control or interference that can determine someone to do or be this rather than that? On this account, negative freedom is freedom from deliberate interference or coercion. It's not the incapacity or inability to do something. For example, I am free to walk out of a door. If you lock me in and I can't leave the room, you render me unfree. If, however, I have a physical disability that prevents me from leaving the room anyway, then I am not thereby rendered unfree. I am simply unable or incapacitated from leaving the room. So only deliberate human interference tends to count in the liberal tradition, in the classical liberal tradition, not, for instance, a constraint like poverty. The fact that poverty prevents me from buying food or buying a round-the-world ticket is not, on Berlin's account, a constraint on my freedom. Okay? Now, the political philosopher credited with the fullest treatment of this idea of freedom is John Locke, though it goes back further to Hobbes and comes very close to our times in the 1970s in the work of Robert Nozick. But in his two treatises of government, Locke asserts the sovereignty of individuals, their sovereign equality, and their natural right to freedom. He shows why individuals decide to give up their unfettered right to freedom, which they enjoyed in the state of nature, and come together to forge a social contract in which they exchange their natural rights for rights that will be protected by the government. They do this because in the state of nature, individuals remain insecure and vulnerable to the depredations of other individuals. So they do it for peace and harmony and to obviate the arbitrary exercise of brute power by one individual against another. This is why they enter into a social contract which generates a government based on consent. Simple story. The only constraints on freedom now are thus constraints that people have authored themselves in the interests of orderly mutual coexistence. This is the best guarantee of every individual's right to life, liberty, and property, and I emphasize property, I'll come back to that, and of the security and freedom of all. As authors of the social contract, however, there's one very important right that individuals retain, which is the right to resist tyranny. If the sovereign, if the government fails to protect them or exercises tyranny or arbitrary force, they have the right to resist and the right to disobey. Now, this is a very simple, basic, but for its time, powerful formulation of the origins of legitimate government, which can only be government by consent. The consent of rational, autonomous individuals, it is presumed, who repudiate the authority of king and church and recognize only the fetters that they have placed upon themselves in order to build a civilized society. Now, what the Lockean contract does is it ensures maximum freedom for every individual to appropriate from nature and to pursue energetically the accumulation of wealth. So the Lockean contract, with its guarantee of individual freedom, could be seen as, on the one hand, emancipatory, in that the idea of popular authorization becomes the source of political authority rather than church or king, but on the other hand, also limited in its purpose of, as Locke's critics have pointed out over time, purpose of facilitating unrestricted capitalist accumulation. The idea of negative freedom, so hold that thought and we'll come back to it. The idea of negative freedom resonates in John Stuart Mill's injunction more than a century after Locke that the only limit on our freedom is the principle of harm to others. It resonates another 100 years after Mill in the writings of Robert Nozick, the most important intellectual descendant of Locke, whose libertarian thinking, we are told, influenced economic thinking in the United States under Reagan, though we hear that Nozick himself, just died a few years ago, was very uncomfortable with that association, however. Now, for Nozick, the moral importance of the separateness of persons is paramount. Individual rights and freedoms are sacrosanct in his theory of justice, which is also substantially about property. Whatever we own is a result of historically sanctified and therefore legitimate acquisition or transfer of property, and any attempt to unsettle this by redistribution is not just impractical, but for Nozick, morally wrong, morally unacceptable. Taxation for redistribution amounts to forced labor, because if the result of redistribution is that you are the generator of wealth, the producer of wealth, and I am on social security, then I am being subsidized by you and by your labor, which is in a way giving me rights in your labor and thereby violating your rights, your person, your property, your labor, right? So this is, in sum, the negative conception of freedom has demonstrated potential for yielding policy prescriptions which are conservative, committed to maintaining the entitlements of property classes, inegalitarian, and definitely hostile to redistribution. At the heart of this hostility lies an analytical ambivalence about what constitutes interference in my freedom. Yeah? And one kind of interference that classical liberals are loath to acknowledge is that caused by structural constraints. A common example in the literature is that workers who've been fired from a factory by the factory owner are free to buy the factory. Right? They are free to buy the factory, but The law does not prohibit it, but we know that that does not really make them free to buy it, right? Clearly, there are structural obstacles, institutional obstacles to freedom, and it's these kinds of interference that are recognized and that are sought to be rectified by those who subscribe to a stronger notion of positive freedom. The pushback against positive freedom has always been present. Let me go back for a minute to Isaiah Berlin, who defines positive liberty as deriving from the wish of the individual to be his own master, not a slave, not dependent on external forces of any kind. And Berlin attributes to Hegel, and then of course to Rousseau and Marx and so on, the idea of a divided self, a real, ideal, autonomous self, which is the true or the higher self of every individual, contrasted with one's empirical self, one's lower self or nature, which is controlled by passion and desire and irrational impulses and so on. So one is free, according to Berlin's interpretation of positive freedom, one is free when one's higher rational self is in control, preventing one from becoming a slave to one's lower self, the self of the passions and the uncontrollable desires. Now, remember, as I said before, that Berlin is writing this in 1958 against the backdrop of Stalinist Russia, and remember also, or maybe you don't know this, that Berlin was Latvian, but his family lived in St. Petersburg, and he was a little child when the Bolshevik Revolution occurred and they fled Russia at the time. So Berlin was deeply suspicious of governments claiming to help the real and higher selves of individuals attain freedom through self-realization on the grounds that they did not know their true self or its interests, and that if they knew better what their true interests were, if they knew better what their true and higher self wanted, this is what they would want. So he was resistant to the idea that he read into the totalitarian project, that people could be told that this was what was best for them, and this was not just in their real interest, but if they knew better, it would also be what they themselves chose. It was in consonance with their higher selves. Okay? Now, apart from the taint of totalitarianism, this is a problem for Berlin also because it constitutes a denial of the pluralism of values which he held very dear. Anyway, so one could argue that such a philosophy, privileging economic development over rights and freedoms for citizens, such as Berlin was pointing to in the case of the Soviet Union, was not characteristic only of the Soviet world. It has also written the developmental strategies of many East Asian countries in the last 50 years, right? Similar charges of at least paternalism, of the state telling citizens that it knows what is best for them, have also been levied against state-directed economic development strategies like our own. But to return to the political theory of this, the tradition that flows from Rousseau, Hegel, and Marx is one of freedom as self-determination, the removal of obstacles, such as wage labor, to human emancipation. Freedom in this sense is not individual-centric, as negative freedom is. It is not individual-centric, it is collective because it involves social cooperation and even social organization. However, it has been charged with giving importance to economic freedom and short shrift to civil and political freedoms. And balancing these two sets of freedoms is what genetically modified liberalism tries to do. So its chosen path is social democracy and welfare rather than a more full-blooded socialism, and political freedoms are as important to it as social and economic freedoms. So positive liberalism can and does accommodate redistribution by defining freedom in positive terms. The basic argument is once again simple, that there are constraints that may not be deliberate or intentional interference, but which nevertheless are significant insofar as you have to get rid of them to free people from terrible things like unemployment, homelessness, disease, ignorance, and all the other things that prevent people from realizing their fullest abilities. I'm sort of paraphrasing T.H. Green here. Poverty is one such constraint, and there is good reason for governments to tax the wealthy to ensure a morally acceptable minimum level of well-being for everyone, so that nobody falls below that minimum and everyone can enjoy what T.H. Marshall called social citizenship, which means, and I quote, the whole range from the right to a modicum of economic welfare and security to the right to share to the full in the social heritage and to live the life of a civilized being according to the standards prevailing in the society, unquote. This is the argument that has underwritten the welfare state of the West, which is why when that welfare state came under attack in the 1980s, the argument was couched in terms of freedom, right? It went like this. The state has become a monstrous, overloaded leviathan. The bureaucracy has a vested interest in administering welfare. Welfare is funded by taxes paid by those who generated the wealth in society, and the poor and unemployed are a morally indefensible burden on this wealth. And this interfering leviathan constitutes a threat to citizens' freedom. This was the essence of the neoliberal attack, a sort of crude version of it. A neoliberal attack on the welfare state, and a particular theory of negative freedom underpinned it. In fact, in response to the claim of social citizenship, you had the argument that people had become passive recipients of welfare rather than active practitioners of citizenship. This argument was commonly made in Thatcher's Britain. It's interesting, there's a sort of neo-Republican idea coming out of a conservative stable. It doesn't really sit well together, but it's there. So you see the positive conception of freedom at work in the justification of the welfare state, right? The welfare state is justified with reference to a notion of positive freedom, and you see negative conceptions of freedom at work in the critique of the welfare state. Both invoke the idea of freedom, but very different conceptions of it. So, what I've been trying to show is that the intellectual terrain of thinking about freedom has been largely colonized by this fierce debate between liberals of a sort of libertarian persuasion, the freedom from people, and the freedom to positive liberals who are supporters of a welfare state to enhance freedom by improving the well-being of all. These are the broad contours of the mainstream debate on freedom, and I'm leaving out the voices of the neo-Roman Republican theorists and others who emphasize freedom as non-domination. There's another tradition altogether. But what happens if we shift the debate beyond this dominant, even if slightly caricatural, framing of freedom from versus freedom to, and shift it to freedom for? This is not a new argument. This is an old argument made by a political theorist called Gerald McCallum a very long time ago, who cast freedom as a triadic relationship, the freedom of X from Y to do Z. Okay? But I'm not going there. Let me very briefly flag one influential treatment of this view, and that is Amartya Sen's development as freedom. I know you'll hear more about this tomorrow, but let me briefly say that for Sen, freedom is both the end of development as well as the means by which you can achieve it, the best means to achieve it. It is good because it enhances individual agency, and it demands the expansion of individual capabilities, the development of individual capabilities, which are for Sen substantive human freedoms. And he proposes 5 freedoms. You'll see they sort of range over every aspect of social life: political freedoms, economic facilities, social opportunities, transparency guarantees, and protective security. And this approach has been criticized for being too individual-centric again, for ignoring the underlying power relations, social relations that can shape capabilities or prevent them from developing, and failing to recognize that some kinds of capability enhancement may need to be socially underwritten, socially organized, rather than individual-centric. So what then are the challenges to evolving a conception of freedom that encompasses the individually experienced freedoms as well as the collectively experienced, and more importantly, the freedoms that we are collectively as a citizenry invested in upholding? Let me just mention 2 examples by way of difficulties. First, wealth determines freedom. I'm not saying this, it's true, I agree with it, but this is from Gerald Cohen. A lack of money brings with it a lack of freedom, and the distribution of property in a society is itself, Cohen says, a distribution of the rights to interference. The distribution of property and the distribution of wealth is itself a distribution of the rights of interference. So freedom of education is a great idea, Offer it to a poor Dalit girl in rural India, and you know even before you've offered it exactly how meaningful your offer is, right? Offer it to a young man who, by a similar accident of birth, is also not free to exercise this choice. Unlike others who have the opportunity and they will only have to choose between different career options, this individual may have to join the masses milling around labor chalks in cities, Indian cities, every morning in search of a day's wage, and feel fortunate if they are chosen to enter into a supremely exploitative arrangement with a contractor who will promise one wage and deliver another. Poverty and destitution are not states of being in which freedom has any meaning at all, even if there is no manifest interference by anybody. It is for this reason that some theorists would have the requirements of legitimacy apply not only to political institutions but also to economic institutions. The power of economic institutions like markets to inhibit freedom is so immense that it does not make sense to speak only of the state as the source of unfreedom. Can there be a theory of political obligation and legitimacy that can speak to these concerns? This is a challenge. The second important critique of standard ways of thinking about freedom is that which comes from feminism. The feminist critique of the social contract as a sexual contract is well known. The freedom of male citizens in classical liberal thinking, also well known, including the positive freedom walas like Rousseau and Hegel, dependent on the unfreedom, the subordination of domestic servants and wives who were seen as naturally inferior and incapable of rationality. Contemporary feminists interrogate the masculinist core in all theories of freedom by asking, for instance, how free is a woman who continues to live in an abusive marriage? How free are women to decide whether to abort a fetus or not? How free are women to report sexual harassment? How similar are the predicaments of women, even in our society, to those of slaves of centuries past who neither questioned nor resisted slavery because they were persuaded by the narrative of their own inferiority? What these two examples suggest is that the other of freedom is domination, and domination is, as we all know, an expression of power. The deliberate or intentional exercise of power on which so many thousands of pages of political theory have been expended, the deliberate or intentional exercise of power to curtail freedom is at one level easier to deal with, because most democratic societies, at least, have the legal and constitutional resources that make it possible for us to do so. It is the invisible forms of structural power, such as class and patriarchy that I just signaled through those two examples, that are much harder to combat or even resist. And one does not have to be a follower of Foucault to recognize this, though it probably helps if one is. And finally, and this is something that needs thinking about, it's possible that the particular difficulty of achieving freedom from the perniciousness of caste and caste discrimination in our society is perhaps that it partakes of both these aspects, the visible and manifest, as well as the invisible and structural. Thank you very much.